Good afternoon. It's Monday afternoon again, and I'm going to do another program. In the last couple of programs, I've been talking a little bit about the electromagnetic spectrum, and I've shown you that picture a couple of times, and there it is again. And if you look at the two extreme ends of the spectrum. On the one end of the spectrum, you've got high intensity, high frequency, short wavelength radiation, gamma rays. And if you go all the way down to the bottom, then you'll find things like radio waves, and I marked in brain waves at the very bottom. They're all part of the same kind of thing, except some have different frequencies and different wavelengths. Well, I've been talking about the spectrum a couple of times, and this time I'm going to talk a little bit about the far end of the spectrum, the high end of the spectrum, where there's a lot of energy and high frequency. And there's a beautiful picture there. I hope you can see it. That's a supernova. That's an exploding star. And when that star explodes, wow, guess what happens? A whole bunch of gamma rays are sent out. Gamma radiation is sent out through the universe. It's measured by astronomy observatories on Earth and all around the planet. So a lot of radiation coming from there. And one of my hypotheses when I write my mystery stories is that at the other end of the spectrum, and I do not have a picture of this, when a person dies, we have a similar thing occurring, except the radiation that goes out from that person, especially if it's a horrific ending to their life, the whirling of a saw blade coming near them, ready to cut off their head, or whether they're about to be shot and killed by someone they know, this horrific end to their existence, long before they want it to happen, causes a burst of energy to come out as they die. They're trying to hold on to their existence. They don't want to leave. They're going against their will, and in this horrifying event, suddenly there's a burst of energy, and these brain waves are sent out, this final burst of brain waves. And that's what's a central part of many of my stories, of the brain waves that these people have sent out. We'll hear more about that as we come to the end of this story, or go a little bit further in this story, and in all of my later stories. So right now, though, we're talking about lightning at 200 Durham Street. And we've gone through a few episodes of that, quite a few chapters of it. We're getting to the next part of it. And just to remind you what's happened to date, there was a murder, a discovery of the body, and the last time I think I was talking to you, they had found out that, just a second here while I play with things, they had found out that the woman had been poisoned, but what they hadn't been able to determine is what the cause of the poisoning was. So that's what's going on now. And so they're interviewing a bunch of people. Chief Petrovic and his policemen, constables are out there interviewing people. And now they have to interview some of the other people involved. That means they have to go to Ottawa. So let's see what happens when they head to the fair city of Ottawa. Okay, and I'm going to read some of this, so I'm going to be looking over to my notes from time to time. You know, traveling by train at those times was not a wonderful experience. I mean, trains have been around for quite a while by then, but they still weren't that smooth. So Friday morning, the Petrovic and the Detective O'Neill, had arrived in Ottawa, and they were at a hotel, not a fancy one. They didn't have a budget for that. They were eating their breakfast, and they were talking a little bit about their train ride, and the chief says, you know, I've ridden a lot of horses, but I have to tell you, I had never been on a train ride before, and that train ride was worse than riding any horse. So the bumping and the jerking and the stopping and the starting. Well, I've been on train rides too, and it's not really that bad. At least it isn't these days. Anyway, they're in Ottawa, and they have to do some interviewing. They have 4 people that they primarily have to interview. They'll have to interview the mother of the murder victim. They'll have to interview Ruth Carter. They'll have to interview. They're going to interview Ruth Carter's nurse, Bella, and they're going to interview the 2 brothers. So that's their plan. And they had hoped initially that they could do these interviews all at Ruth Carter's home. But as it turned out, couldn't be done. And it couldn't be done because the 2 Carter boys will have nothing to do with their mother. Well, let's see what we find out as I read some more of this. So they head out to Ruth Carter's home. And let's see what I've got here. It says that they want to interview the nurse, Bella, because she is the one who looks after Ruth Carter and knows a lot about what's going on. So they get to the house and they're ready to do the interview with Ruth Carter. And so they are sipping their coffee. They get in their car. They head out, go through a beautiful neighborhood, and they arrive after 15 minutes at Ruth Carter's home. They enjoyed their ride through that section of Ottawa. The people that lived along that street had large houses with large lawns. They pulled into a driveway lined on both sides by cedar hedges and parked in front of a large 2.5-story home that was built in the 1880s. A woman about 50 years old wearing a nurse's uniform arrived at the door. She had a pleasant smile. She introduced herself as Nurse Bella. She explained that Mrs. Carter had to use a wheelchair to get around, and if they'd come into the sitting room, she would bring Mrs. Carter in to see them. So Mrs. Carter arrives, and the interview starts. Of course, it started with the 2 policemen, Chief Petrovic and Detective O'Neill, giving their condolences to Mrs. Carter. Mrs. Carter said she understood that. She was still very upset, but she was ready for her interview. She asked the chief about Chaseford. She said, "I'd like to know what's going on there." She had grown up in the region. That's where her husband was elected as a member of parliament from that area. And she lived there for many years and still, well, her daughter particularly, Louise, wanted to go back there regularly because she had such fond memories of growing up in the Chaseford, aka Stratford area. And once they had the introductions out of the way and had the small chat out of the way, she found out that there was really very little that Mrs. Carter could add to their information. They knew that the body had been identified, they knew it was her daughter, and she didn't have much else to say. So Bella came in and they interviewed Bella. And Bella said, right at the start, "I would like to let you know about a conversation that Ruth Carter and I had earlier today. Before you arrived, Mrs. Carter told me that I could speak to you about anything and answer any of your questions. And there's nothing that I shouldn't talk about if you have questions." Well, the chief and the detective and O'Neill were kind of surprised at how forthright Bella was and how forthright Mrs. Carter was. But that's good. That's good for them, right? So they proceeded with the interview. Chief said, "Tell us about the relationship that Louise had with her mother." Oh, they had a very strong relationship, very strong daughter-mother connection. They loved each other. Louise would do anything for her mother. Um, and her mother, on the other hand, was happy to see Louise go on her trips, and it was even happier to see her come back. And what about this latest trip? Asked Detective O'Neill. I think Louise enjoyed traveling, said Bella, and she liked to get out and about. Um, and of course, this trip was one she took every year when she went down to Chaseford. Louise, this is Bella talking, Louise remembered growing up and attending school there. She had a lot of happy memories about it. And her mother, that's Ruth, and Louise both had enjoyed visiting that cottage. Well, visiting the cottage came as a bit of a surprise to Chief Petrovic because he really hadn't known anything about the place until the body had been discovered there. And Bella went on to say this was kind of a retreat that they could go to. It was a nice, quiet place. It was peaceful. It was some place where they could relax. And so right then Petrovic thought, I need to find out more about this cottage, because if I can find out more about it, maybe I'll know who else may have frequented there and help us in our investigation. And then the next question was a tough one, but one they wanted to ask. They said to Bella, describe the relationship that Louise had with her brothers. Bella frowned and said, it's a good thing Mrs. Carter encouraged me to speak freely. I'd say the main thing in the relationship is their mutual dislike for one another. There it is. Dislike. Amos and Proctor are respectively 5 and 7 years younger than their sister Louise. In some ways, Louise had some of the skills that her father had. She was open and friendly and found it very easy to talk to other people, and she was genuinely interested in them. Once you got to know Louise, you knew she was a good person. Her brothers are both very intelligent, said Bella, but don't be fooled by them in an interview. They are both self-made men and proud of it. They always felt their sister was favored over them by their parents. The boys don't trust other people. When you meet them, you'll think they're very reasonable, very intelligent, which they are. But when they decide they're not happy, they can be very intimidating. It's obvious they don't like their mother or their sister. I never understood exactly why. This is Bella time. They thought that their sister traveling around and that her interest in history was a waste of time and a waste of money. Remember, these are self-made men. In particular, she should make her money work for her. Or even better, work for them. They wanted her to invest in their companies. The other major disagreement was over the bushland near Chaseford. Of course, that's where the cabin is. The land isn't worth anything, they told her. You can't grow a crop on it, so what good is it? Right? Of course, both Louise and her mother liked the solitude and quiet that it brought them. The boys thought that was just a silliness. It wasn't worth anything. 4,000 acres of land there. You know, we could sell it to somebody and take that money and invest it in something else. Anyway, their interview with Bella went on for quite some time. And then they realized that they'd have to go on and try and locate the two boys and conduct those interviews. They had addresses for them, and they'd been provided a chauffeur by Rutherford, the assistant chief of the Ottawa police. And the chauffeur, George Brown, was ready to drive them to their next interview spot. So they arrived in front of a building He pulled up in front of a building, and there was a sign on it, Carter's Surveys Incorporated. Their timing was almost perfect. They entered through the front door and arrived in a reception area. They were met by a large man. He was probably at least 6'4" and likely weighed over 250 pounds. He had neatly trimmed black beard, and his hair was the same color. "Thank you for being prompt," he said. "My name is Amos Carter. My brother Proctor is already here in one of our other office rooms towards the back of the building. I assume you'll wish to interview us one at a time. Unless you wish it otherwise, I'm going first. I have some clients I should get ready for. They're coming here to meet with me a little later in the afternoon. If you'll excuse me, I'll go and I'll tell Proctor that you're here, and when you're finished with me, you can talk to him." With that, he turned and walked down the hall. "Well," said Detective O'Neill, "he's kind of impressive, isn't he?" To the chief. It was a quiet aside. "He does like to be in charge, doesn't he? Let's see what kind of interview he gives us." So they went into the room and waited a minute, and then Amos appeared. He sat down in one of the empty chairs and said, how can I help you gentlemen of the law?" And with that, the interview started. They always started their interviews with easy questions. That helps get people relaxed and maybe ready to answer some tougher questions. The interview seemed to go well. Amos Carter was not knowledgeable, was not uncomfortable at all, I should say. And you can tell that from the original introduction. He answered the questions succinctly, and when asked, he would elaborate on his answers. When asked about his mother and his sister, he said, "To others, they seem to be very nice people, but my brother and I don't get along with them. When my dad was alive, things were cordial, but because my father was a great peacemaker. He was a man with ideas. He helped Proctor and me a great deal. He helped us set up our businesses. When he died, Proctor and I assumed we would look after the family and make all the decisions. We were mistaken. My mother and Sister Louise told us in no uncertain terms that they could look after themselves, so we let them." Just trying to sneak in a question, Detective O'Neill said, "What do you think of your mother's nurse, Bella?" Amos' face colored up a bit and he said, "I'll say this as nicely as I can. She's an interfering busybody. She's already had every opportunity to offer an opinion, even when she's not asked. I think she's given some very poor advice to my mother and to my sister." "And what's your opinion of the bush?" asked O'Neill. "Simply put," Amos said, "that bush is of no use to anyone." So that interview was pretty well over. They didn't learn a lot because Amos hadn't had a lot to do with his sister. So now next on the list was Proctor. Proctor's a couple of years younger than Amos. Let's see what happens with that interview. Proctor had a somewhat similar appearance to his older brother. Perhaps he was an inch shorter and carried a little less weight, but he was still a very large man. He had a mustache. In their introductory questions, the chief and detective learned that he also ran a business. He started out with a small lumber yard, and now he had lumber yards in Ottawa, Toronto, and Montreal. As the interview went on, it became obvious he was less confident than his older brother, a much more nervous person. From his demeanor, one could say at times that he appeared shifty. He didn't avoid answering questions, though. When they got to the relationship with his mother and his sister, his response was similar to the answer Amos had given. When they asked about Bella, he kind of averted his eyes, looked down and said, "I like Bella. We were friends. I've known her for several years. She's a very competent person and an excellent nurse. When my mother had the stroke, I highly recommended that Bella apply for the position of caregiver to my mother." Unless Bella told them, my mother and my sister Louise were never aware of my recommendation. Once Bella got the job, I gradually got cut off from her. My brother Amos said, "Good riddance. He doesn't like Bella at all." The chief moved the interview along. "Proctor," he said, "you're a lumberman. What do you think of the bush near Chaseford?" "Well," Proctor said, "it's none of my business. My father left the bush to my mother and Louise. He did that even though he knew of my interest in lumber and trees. The bush meant something to him. It had been in the family since about 1840. I guess he didn't want to see it tampered with. Sitting as it is now, it's not of much use to anyone." Then O'Neill said, "Proctor, do you know anything about the cabin?" "Well, I didn't know there was a cabin in the bush until I read about it in the paper," Proctor replied. The chief stood up and said, he was surprised at the answer, but he stood up and said, "Thank you very much. If we have further questions, we'll get back to you." So now they've interviewed everyone they came to Ottawa to interview. They've learned a few things, and I don't know whether they're closer to the truth or not. I suppose I should know. It's my book. But they're ready now. They've collected what they need to do. So they have a train to catch early the next morning. That'll be a Saturday morning. And we'll see what happens when they get back to town, when they get back to Chaseford. Maybe they can ask some of the locals there about the cabin, which apparently a lot of people knew about, but Chief Petrovic didn't know about it. We'll find out. A couple of other notes, things I wanted to say. Earlier this week, I guess, or actually last week, last Tuesday, I finished my 35th book in the series. It's called Karma Strikes. The bad guy at the very end has terrible things happen to him. Don't you love that? The other thing I'm going to leave you with is a puzzle. I'll show you the puzzle here, if I can find it. There it is. Do you know this person, Lair's relic? It's a simple puzzle for you to solve. If you can figure it out, well, you're pretty good. Thank you for your time.